In this, now getting close to our final lecture, we were almost there. We're talking about Standard 621, or Key Concept 621, where Europe, of course, is dominating the global political order by the 20th century. But we're going to start to see the breakup of older land-based empires, and eventually in the 20th century, the breakup of some of the overseas empires that had developed in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So first I want to talk about old empires that had long existed that will see their end in the 20th century. And we're going to go through three of them really quickly here. Qing, China, the Ching Dynasty in China. Then we're going to talk about the Russian Empire. And then we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire. And those three are going to fall very quickly in that order. Qing, China, the Russian Empire, then the Ottoman Empire. For each of these states, I want to talk about internal and external reasons that they fall. We've been doing this all year, guys. Whenever a society collapses, whenever a civilization falls, whenever a dynasty ends, it's likely the interplay, or it's going to be the interplay of internal problems and external problems, and in many cases those are related to each other. For example, we've long talked, if a society is facing a lot of barbarians at the gate, like the Romans might have said, if the society is facing a lot of outsiders trying to come in, they might have to expend more resources on their military. Expending more resources on the military causes frustrations internally, right? So we can see how there's always internal and external problems for societies, and that's why they fall. So let's start with the Qing Dynasty in China. We remember that the Qing Dynasty has been around since the 17th century. It rose in the 1600s. This was a Manchurian dynasty. They were outsiders, all right? The Manchu people are from up here in what is the region of Manchuria. Today it's part of China. The Manchu people were from up here. And in the 1600s, they're going to conquer Beijing. They're going to topple the Ming Dynasty. By the 19th century, the Qing Dynasty is showing its weakness, especially at the growing strength of Europe. All right? So for China, for Qing China, I actually want to start with external problems that will lead to ultimately the fall of the dynasty. We remember by the 19th century, European nations see China as a great prize because of its massive population. What a tremendous resource to be able to sell the products of your Industrial Revolution to these Chinese people. And the attempts, especially by the British government, to import opium into China in the 19th century, this drug, right, this highly addictive heroin-like drug. It's made from the same thing that modern heroin is made out of. The importation, or the desire to trade this opium, would lead to a couple wars between the British and the Qing Dynasty in China. And in each of those wars, called the Opium Wars, China would lose. Now, while Britain or France or any other nation was never able to outright conquer all of China during the 19th century, or at any time, they were able to force the Qing Dynasty to sign a series of what are known as unequal treaties. Treaties that favor the British, and eventually treaties that favor the French and the Germans and later Americans. And so the doors to Chinese trade will be blown open starting with the Opium War. And this begins to show a weakness of the Chinese state as foreigners who had long been kept on the fringes of Chinese society now start to enter China. In 1895, China will fight a war against the growing Japanese power. You guys remember with the Meiji Restoration, Japan moved to industrialize and westernize and modernize its military. In 1895, Japan turned that military against China, and they fought a war called the Sino-Japanese War. Yeah, the first Sino-Japanese War, with the second not being until the lead up to World War II. Japan wins that war. And they take some land from, some trading concessions from China. They ultimately are going to gain control of the Korean peninsula, which had previously been dominated by China. So we've got a lot of outsiders pressing into China, causing weakness in the Chinese empire. In the early 20th century, we've already mentioned this, but the Boxer Rebellion will begin in China, which is a revolt against foreign influence in China. A revolt against foreign influence in China. But the Boxers aren't only striking against the foreigners in China, they also strike against the government of China that they see as allowing this to have happened. In the end, it actually causes the exact same thing that the Chinese were trying, or the Boxers were trying to avoid. They were fighting a rebellion to drive out Western influence and Japanese influence. And guess what the Japanese and the Americans and the British and the French do when the Boxers revolt? They send more troops. They send more influence to the area, which further weakens the Chinese state. To add insult to injury, following the Boxer Rebellion, the foreign powers forced China and forced the Chinese state to pay them for their costs and losses in the Boxer Rebellion. So we can see by the early 20th century, the Chinese dynasty is hanging by a thread. We will add to this internal problems. Disastrous peasant revolts in the mid-19th century. We mentioned the Taiping Rebellion, which was a massive revolt of Chinese peasants that would leave millions upon millions of Chinese dead, and the government expending huge resources to put down this rebellion. And then we've got a problem that we're going to see repeated again and again and again through world history. When the leaders of an empire are so disconnected from what's happening in their country that they just can't relate, they can't understand, and they can't react to problems. And nowhere is this seen more clearly than in China. Because if you remember, the Ming Dynasty built a palace complex called the Forbidden City. And while it was, of course, forbidden for outsiders to enter the Forbidden City, it was also ultimately forbidden for the emperor himself to leave the Forbidden City. And Chinese Qing leaders, by the early 20th century, were essentially holed up in their Forbidden City. Now, it's a massive complex. You could live your entire life in there and not skip a beat. Anything you would ever want would be in there. But they have no concept of what's happening on the outside of those walls. And we add to that, in the early 20th century, one of the youngest Chinese emperors ever to rule, a boy named Puyi, P-U-Y-I. He's the last Chinese emperor. I believe he gains control when he's only 4 years old. It's actually his mother that's really running a lot of the show. But it just signals some weakness in the Chinese dynasty when coupled with the internal and external problems they're already dealing with. By 1911, rebellions will grow and will ultimately overthrow the Qing dynasty, with one of the central leaders of these Chinese rebellions pushing for an end to dynastic rule being a man named Sun Yat-sen. Probably not a name that's going to come up on AP World, but not a bad name to have in your memory bank. Sun Yat-sen as one of the leaders of the revolutionary movement in China that ultimately brings the Chinese Republic. No king, no emperor anymore. And this, if we go back to our song from the beginning of the year, Shangzhou Qinhan, Shangzhou Qinhan, sweet, not Wu-Tang Clan. Come on. Shangzhou Qinhan, Shangzhou Qinhan, sweet Tang song, sweet Tang song. Wan Ming Qing Republic. Now, Republic, no emperor. All right? And then eventually we're going to get to Mao Zedong. All right. So there's the Ching Dynasty. 2,000 years of largely unbroken dynastic rule in China coming to an end. All right? No, and it will never come back. This is what makes this different from other time periods. Like, for example, when the Han Dynasty fell, there was a breakup of centralization in China, but ultimately, fast forward a few centuries, and you're going to see a new dynasty assert control. We certainly haven't seen that in a century, at least. Maybe more time will. We don't know. All right. The next emperor we're going to talk about is the Russian Empire, sees its end in the 20th century. So, hey, here we go again. The Qing Dynasty, born in the 17th century, falls in the 20th century. The Russian Romanov Dynasty, born in the early 17th century, it's going to fall by the early 20th century. We've got a little parallel of years, which is just coincidental, doesn't mean anything. The Russian Empire likewise will be suffering from internal problems and external problems that will ultimately lead to its fall. Internally, we need to remember, and we've talked about most of this stuff before, internally we want to remember that the Russian state was slower to industrialize. They were lagging behind their Western European counterparts, right? They had a very small middle class. If we remember in Western Europe, the growth of a middle class in the late Middle Ages ultimately provided a lot of the wealth and resources that would allow something like the Industrial Revolution to take place. Russia didn't have that middle class. Russia was long ruled by a czar, an autocratic czar, one guy ruling, a czar and an elite aristocracy. And then no middle class and a vast peasantry, with the peasantry dominated by what people in Russia?
Boyars.
Not the boyars. The boyars were the landowners. The peasantry, well, I guess they were dominated by, what made up the majority of the peasantry in Russia before 1861? The serfs, the slaves of Russia, right? The people that were, like, by Russian law, tied to their land, and even their children would be tied to that land. So Russia lacks any kind of middle class that could lead in developing that state. So where does Russia get its industrialization from? They've got to borrow a lot of money. They've got to pay outsiders to come in and start to build. And this becomes a massive expense and debt that the Russian Empire has to pay. As we push into the 20th century, though, we do start to see a small middle class grow. And as you can imagine, as a middle class begins to grow, it's small, but it begins to grow in the early 20th century, that they're going to start wanting what middle class people in Western Europe have. And what do middle class people, what do landowners in Western Europe have that Russian middle class folks don't? Political representation, political rights. They don't have that in Russia. Russia at the turn of the century is the most autocratic state in Europe. All right? Nobody is less free than the Russian people. Nobody has less political representation than the Russian people. In 1904, and I'm going to hop to an external problem, then we'll get back to the internal issues. In 1904, just like China before it, here's another similarity between the two and their fall. Russia will fight a disastrous war against the Japanese, called the Russo-Japanese War. I love these wars because it makes it easy to remember who's fighting in them. 1904, 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. Japan will win. Now this for Japan is a tremendous triumph because it is an Asian nation. First time in the modern times that an Asian nation would defeat a white European power in war. So Japan wins. But for Russia, it is going to signal a disastrous tune for the Russian Tsar. Popular protests will swell. Anger and frustration with the Tsar will swell. And the last Tsar of Russia, a guy named Nicholas II, will establish or will allow the establishment of what is called the Duma. The Duma, D-U-M-A, the Duma. This is a representative body of the Russian people. It's essentially a parliament for Russia. But every time the Duma has anything to critique about the Tsar shuts it down. Imagine if Barack Obama, anytime the Republican Congress challenged him or critiqued him, that Barack Obama could just eliminate that branch of our government. That's the power that the Tsar had. And you can imagine when the Tsar gives the people a Duma and then takes it away, that's almost worse than never having it in the first place, right? Like if I were to give you $100 and you were like, what? $100? Then I take it away from you. And you're like, oh, that sucks. Now you will feel like you've lost something, even though you never had it to begin with. You might have been better off never even being given that gift. All right? Things don't get any better for Russia. Things don't get any better for Russia when in 1914, the First World War begins. You remember we went through really quickly this story the other day. Russia had an entente, an agreement with France. Russia also had a desire to support the Slavic peoples in the Balkan Peninsula, like the Serbs. Russia, now don't get me wrong, there's some notions of what's called pan-Slavism, all Slavic peoples kind of standing together. Russians are Slavs, Serbs are Slavs. But what does Russia really want out of the Balkan Peninsula? Growing to the Mediterranean Sea, getting that warm water port. So Russia hoped that they could support Serbia, defeat Austria-Hungary, gain more power in the Balkan Peninsula, and get a warm water port. Russia chose poorly. And in this war that will break out between Germany and Russia and Austria and Russia and the Ottoman Empire and Russia, because guys, look what Russia has to deal with, right? It's the biggest country in the world. And so they're going to be fighting the Germans on the German border. They're going to be fighting the Austrians on the Austrian border. They're going to be fighting the Ottomans on their border with the Ottoman Empire. Russia is essentially fighting a three-front war. It will prove disastrous for Russia. And no one country will lose more soldiers during the First World War than the Russian state. And the second. But we're not there yet. With the disaster of World War I, by 1917, the people have had enough, and they rise up, and in February of 1917, they overthrow the Tsar. Tsar Nicholas II is ousted from power. He and his family are rounded up. That's the February Revolution. Okay. I say February and October. If we were to go strictly by our calendar, it would be March and November. Russia used, I should say, a different calendar at that time. So in Russian history, we call this the February Revolution, and then later the October Revolution. Now, after the revolution, after the Tsar is ousted, a provisional government is established. The provisional government fails to get Russia out of the war as well. And this is a tough position to be in. We know the people don't want to be fighting the war anymore. But what does quitting the war, what does surrendering to Germany in 1917 mean? Germany's going to take everything. And they'll prove that they will do that. Yes. We're not there yet. But so the provisional government from February of 1917 to October of 1917 fails to get Russia out of the war. And so in October, we have a second revolution. This is called the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia, led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin. We've already mentioned him. And this is the second Russian Revolution. Doesn't overthrow the Tsar, it overthrows the provisional government. And these are these Bolsheviks, they're the ones that ultimately completely end the Romanov dynasty by executing Nicholas II and his family. Maybe not Anastasia, probably Anastasia too. But some people believe she escaped somehow. Doubtful. You watched the movie. She does escape. Okay, so then there you have it. A cartoon told us Anastasia survived. Anyhow, the end of the Russian Empire. Finally, the Ottoman Empire. Now, we've already talked about Ottoman Empire being referred to as the sick man of Europe, right? They've got their own internal problems. The Ottoman Empire's internal problems are centered on the problem long experienced by empires of controlling a massive, what I've called a massive multi-ethnic empire. And by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is referred to, at least by Europeans, as the sick man of Europe. So the Ottoman Empire is struggling to hold on to an empire that is made up of many different nationalities. And if you recall, in the 19th century, we have the growth in the idea of a nationalist identity. Nationalism is on the rise. And different groups within the Ottoman Empire begin to fight and advocate for their own independence. The Greeks, for example, fight for and gain their independence from the Ottoman Empire. The Serbs will fight for and gain their independence from the Ottoman Empire. And their independence is going to lead to other groups within the Ottoman Empire clamoring for the same thing. Now, as we already mentioned, the Ottoman Empire will attempt reforms. Does anybody recall the name of a series of reforms that lasted decades in the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman reforms called Tanzimat, the Tanzimat era. They will try to reform, offer political equality of all subjects, regardless of national heritage or religion. Tanzimat, Tanzimat. But ultimately, these reforms don't go far enough. And by the early 20th century, there's a little bit of a pushback of Turks, a group of Turks known as the Young Turks, who are advocating Turkish dominance over the government in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire will have a series of external problems as well. The growth of the Russian state in the 19th century will take the northern part of the Ottoman Empire from the Ottomans and grant it to Russia. This is centered on a war in the 1850s called the Crimean War, where the Ottoman Empire will wage war against Russia. Now, in this war, interestingly enough, Britain and France aid the Ottomans. Not because they love the Ottoman Empire, but because they want to stop the growth of Russia. Britain and France help the Ottomans to fight the Russians. But what this leaves for the Ottomans is, after this war, a Britain especially and a France that want to exert control within the Ottoman Empire. For example, by the early 20th century, you don't need to write this down, just hear it. Britain had such authority in the Ottoman Empire that if you were a British subject in the Ottoman Empire, working, say, in Constantinople or in Istanbul, if you were a British subject and you committed a crime, you would be tried not in an Ottoman court, but in a British court. All right? And this is chipping away at the sovereignty of the authority of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire will ultimately choose poorly as well in World War I. They will join the side of the Germans and the Austrians in World War I. For a couple reasons. One, the Ottoman Empire had an economic relationship with Germany. Germans were building a railroad in the Ottoman Empire from Istanbul, making its way down into Mecca was the plan, into Baghdad. The Germans were building railroads in the Ottomans. But also, who do you think the Ottomans thought were going to win the war?
Germany.
Germans. You don't join a war with someone else if you think they're going to lose. You joined the war with Germany because you think Germany's going to win. And also, remember, the Ottomans have beef with Russia, and Russia's on the British and the French side. So the Ottomans join the side of the Germans, and this proves disastrous for the Ottoman Empire. We must remember the same problem that Russia's going to have. The Ottomans are going to be fighting in the Middle East against the British and the Arabs. The Ottomans are going to be fighting along their border with the Russians. The Ottomans are going to be fighting along the straits at a battle called Gallipoli against the British. The Ottomans are forced to divide their armies up as well. Disaster for Russia. Question? Yes.
Okay.
Or disaster for the Ottomans. Yes.
Okay, so Britain and France for the Crimean War, they were with Ottomans.
Mm-hmm.
And then Britain and France joined Russia.
Yes.
They didn't want Russia to spread, so why are they joining?
Because by the 1850s, Britain and France were worried about a growing Russia. Germany didn't exist in 1850. Germany doesn't unify until 1871. By 1914, Russia is weak. Russia's fallen apart. Okay, remember all those internal problems we just talked about. But Germany is the big threat. So it's just like, think of all the people that you are friends with today that you hated 6 months ago, and the people you disliked 6 months ago you're friends with today. Things change. Times change people. Times change states and relationships between them. Good? Good. So 3 long-lasting empires. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ching Dynasty in China, all gone now by the early 20th century. In place of the old Ottoman Empire, we will have a new Turkish state. This is after World War I. And he will Turkey will be led by a man named Mustafa Kemal, also known as Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk means father of the Turks. He's like the George Washington for Turkey. He will push Turkey, much like the Japanese did. He will push Turkey to be more modernized, westernized, but for Turkey, we're going to use a word, secularized. What? Is that a word we know?
Yes.
Secularized. What that means? No religion. Kind of, because most people within Turkey are Muslim. But the Turkish government, established by Mustafa Kemal, is a secular government. Kind of like most Americans happen to be Christian, but we have a secular government. Right? Yes?
It's the same guys that pushed for the Treaty of Sevres and to kick
Yes,
out
absolutely, but that's beyond AP World.
so this guy, you saying this guy was secular?
He was a secular guy. He was Muslim, but he didn't rule Turkey as an Islamic state. All right, we're going to press. We're almost done here, guys. This standard also requires us to talk about not only the end of some empires, but some colonies beginning to push for their own independence. And we got 2 different kinds of ways nations are going to gain their independence. Relatively peacefully and quite violently. All right? We're going to talk about the relatively peaceful one first. India and their independence from Britain. Now, the independence movement in India was born almost as early as India began to be dominated by outsiders. But certainly by the late 19th century, we begin to see strong pushes for Indian self-rule. When I say Indian self-rule, we mean India ruled by Indians. In 1885, an organization called the Indian National Congress will be founded. It's made up of mostly Hindus in India. We must remember that India is mostly a Hindu nation, but there is a large minority of Muslims in India, particularly in the northern parts of India.
So this is more like Pakistan as well.
This is, not yet. This is the Indian National Congress, created to advocate for Indian self-rule. In 1906, another organization is founded called the Muslim League, because many Muslims in India saw the INC, the Indian National Congress, being dominated by Hindus. So they're like, what about us? So the Muslim League was born in 1906 to advocate for Indian Muslims. Both of these organizations would push the British for more self-rule. Things will come to a head in 1919 with a disastrous event in Indian history known as the Amritsar Massacre. The Amritsar Massacre.
1916?
In 1919. when over 300 Indians who were taking part in a peaceful protest were massacred by British soldiers. They were within a park, and the park was walled off, and they couldn't escape the British soldiers firing upon them. And over 300 will be killed. This emboldens the movement for Indian statehood, for Indian self-rule. And now I also want you to note, too, that this is in 1919. 1919 is right after the First World War. And after the First World War, during the First World War, one of the factors that will aid in the British and the French winning the First World War is that they were able to rely on their colonies to provide resources and manpower for the British Army or the French Army. And please recognize that thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Indian soldiers would go and fight and go and die for the British Empire during World War I. After the war, the global powers got together in France to end the war, to sign a treaty. And thanks to a guy like Woodrow Wilson, who established what was called his 14 points to bring the war to an end, one of those 14 points talked about the self-determination of people of the world to decide for themselves how they wanted to be ruled. Now, of course, in a treaty negotiated by the British and the French and the Americans and the Italians, the British and the French and the Americans, what do you think the British and the French are going to think about self-rule and self-determination for people under their colonial powers? No. They will agree with self-rule for like white Europeans in the Balkan Peninsula, but they don't see an agreement with self-rule for Indians. India was the crown jewel of the British Empire. So they're not going to be down with that. So no independence for India after World War I. But with this massacre in 1919 and a greater push for nationalism, the Indian self-rule movement will grow. This is going to largely be led by the man you see there on the right. That's Mohandas Gandhi. Mohandas Gandhi. He's a lawyer by trade, and he has long been an advocate for Indian self-rule. After World War I, Gandhi will become the most strongest voice for Indian self-rule. And he will employ the ideas of passive resistance and civil disobedience to gain that rule. Please know those two phrases. Passive resistance. I'm going to resist you, but I'm not going to fight you. This is his nonviolent idea, right? I'm going to resist you, I'm not going to fight you. If you're going to fight me, I will not fight back. Because I want the world to look at what Britain is doing to India. And I want the world, Gandhi would say, to see Britain as the aggressor. I want the world to see Britain as wrong. And I want pressure then to mount against the British to end this policy in India. The same policies that would be employed by Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States of nonviolence, peaceful resistance, passive resistance, and civil disobedience. Breaking laws that you feel are unjust. Yes, ma'am?
So, I mean, to me this seems like a big genius. Because it like makes everybody else look at, so why aren't other people in other parts of the world doing this?
Others will. Martin Luther King Jr. will, ultimately. So it will happen. But it takes a big person, right? Like I think you've got to overcome something about human nature for when someone's smacking you to not smack them back. And I think that is what has elevated him to the place that he ultimately has been elevated in the history of the world. All right. So what kind of passive resistance? Primarily boycotts of British goods. For example, in one of the great stories of the Industrial Revolution, remember, India was a great cotton producer, right? And the Indian subcontinent would be transformed into a series of cotton plantations, with that cotton being exported to Britain to go through British textiles. and it would be turned into cloth and linens. That would be turned into clothes that would be sent back to India for Indian people to buy. This made no sense to Gandhi. Indians had for centuries, for millennia, been making their own cotton and producing their own textiles and producing their own clothing. Why are they now shipping their cotton to Britain only to be sent back to pay inflated prices for these clothes? So he would refuse to do that. And he would call on Indians to begin to produce again their own clothing and not to buy it from imperial sellers. He would also call for strikes, for Indian workers to go on strike in protest of their working conditions. Following World War II, with the British Empire weak and broke after the Second World War, Britain was unwilling and unable now to hold on and contain the movement for independence of India. And they would grant India their independence. 1947. World War II ends in 45. By 1947, India is independent. But this doesn't mean peace and harmony for the new Indian nation, because almost immediately upon the British announcing that they will withdraw, clashes will begin between Indian Hindus and Indian Muslims. Indian Muslims led by this man, whose name is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Violence between Hindus and Muslims in India will result in a couple consequences. First, Gandhi will be assassinated. Gandhi will be assassinated by Hindus that don't want to see a secular government in India like Gandhi advocated for. He was killed, assassinated.
That's what that insinuates.
And then Muhammad Ali Jinnah will push for an independent state for Muslims in South Asia. Ultimately, the resolution to this problem was a divided India. And India divided into essentially thirds, with West Pakistan here in the northwest, which is primarily Muslim, East Pakistan in the east, which is primarily Muslim, and then the rest, India, which is primarily Hindu. Eventually, East Pakistan, which is, can you imagine how difficult it would be to rule a nation so divided? East Pakistan will break from West Pakistan and become the nation of Bangladesh in 1971. The division between India and Pakistan, though, that doesn't solve any problems either. And India and Pakistan will be at a state of near constant warfare for much of the next 60, 70 years. They'll fight, I believe it's 4 separate wars. And today, both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers with tremendous border disputes with each other. They don't agree on the lines between their nations. So that's the result of the end of colonial rule in South Asia. We're going to finish up right now talking about so, even though this sounds really violent, right? This was Britain kind of just leaving, negotiating an end. Muslims, you can have this. Hindus, you can have this. We're outie. France gives a very different story. Some colonies are going to achieve their independence through armed struggle. And here we're going to look at 2 French colonies of Vietnam and Algeria. First, talking about Southeast Asia. France had controlled Southeast Asia since the 1880s. And as soon as France entered Southeast Asia, we would see a movement of Vietnamese to gain more independence, or gain their independence.
In the what year?
In the 1880s. In 1919, a Vietnamese nationalist leader named Ho Chi Minh. Tyler's very excited here, guys. a Vietnamese nationalist leader named Ho Chi Minh will go to Paris. That's where the Paris Peace Conference is being held. And he will advocate for Vietnamese nationalism at the Paris Peace Conference. What do you think France is going to think about that?
They dismissed him.
France isn't going to listen to this. Just like Britain didn't want to listen about Indian independence. And so as he is rebuffed by the French at the Paris Peace Conference, he begins to start to read and begins to be influenced by communist ideology. Seeing the domination of Vietnam by France as just a part of the capitalist domination of the world. After World War II, and I should say during World War II, Ho Chi Minh is in Vietnam fighting against the French and eventually the Japanese to gain the independence for the Vietnamese people. At the end of World War II, when the Vietnamese helped defeat the Japanese in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh declares independence for Vietnam. Unfortunately for Ho Chi Minh and Vietnamese independence, the immediate end of World War II begins what?
Cold War.
The Cold War. World War II turns immediately into the Cold War, where the United States wants to not allow the spreading of communism anywhere around the world. Now this becomes important because the United States honestly didn't really care about Vietnam. We cared about France. And France was threatened by communism. There was a growing communist party in France. Side note, just a bit of trivia, Ho Chi Minh in the early 1920s was one of the founding members of the Communist Party in France. Crazy. France had a growing communist party in the 1940s. And after France in World War II was war-torn and the economy was devastated, the United States was worried that France might become communist itself. And that maybe allowing Vietnamese independence would push France even further towards communism. So the United States supported French claims in Southeast Asia. This will result in war. Ho Chi Minh will first lead his armies against French colonialism. This is through the 1940s and early 50s, with the Americans giving financial and military support to the French. Ho Chi Minh wins. His armies win. And we will see the result being a divided Vietnam. A Vietnam divided in half, with the northern part of Vietnam being ruled by Ho Chi Minh and the communists, and the southern part of Vietnam being ruled by an anti-communist dictatorship, all right, supported by the Americans. The Americans will continue to support the government of South Vietnam, eventually with a massive war ourselves. From 1964 to 1973, the United States will send hundreds of thousands of troops to South Vietnam to defend South Vietnam against communist forces in the north and communist forces in the south. There's a lot more to this story we'll talk about when you're seniors. Ultimately, by 1973, the United States leaves. After the United States leaves, the communist North Vietnam invades South Vietnam and ultimately conquers the country. And they unify Vietnam under one communist government. So there is the new Vietnam after the Vietnam War. Here is a country gaining its independence through violent warfare. All right? Another example, again dealing with the French, is in Algeria. All right. In the 1950s, Arab nationalists in Algeria will begin a revolutionary movement against the French to drive the French colonialists out of Algeria. France, again, responds with their army, trying to hold on to this colony. Violent warfare between the French army and Algerian nationalists will erupt, And by 1962, the French government will ultimately leave Algeria and grant independence to the Algerian colony. 1962. Following this, we will see a massive migration of white French Algerians heading back to France because they don't want to live in an Algeria that's not a French colony anymore. So we've got one good example of a nationalist movement that is largely nonviolent, and Britain grants independence to India, and two examples of very violent independence movements. First in Vietnam. Vietnam actually gives inspiration to the Algerians, who then fight the French as well, and France ultimately loses much of their empire.